Hello, everybody. This is Fun Police, and just this week, right as I'm recording this, I have just received word that I have 100 subscribers. So I just want to thank everybody for subscribing and enjoying the content. It's definitely something I enjoy doing, and I got big plans. And as such, starting today, all the deck techs are actually going to have gameplay now. It's been something that a lot of you have requested, and I want to start doing it now, especially now that everybody's subscribing and seeming to really enjoy the content. So for today, we're going to do the deck tech, and then I'm going to leave it off with 3 games. I'm not going to have any commentary over the games. Let me know down in the comments if you would prefer commentary or not. But otherwise, let's just get into the deck. This deck is courtesy of JKing7 and he took it to the latest OCC for July, and it is a ramp deck, namely a US-British ramp deck. Just for those that don't know, JKing is arguably one of the top players. He almost consistently lands as number 1 on the OCC, or on the Officer Club ladder. So anything he builds is absolutely going to be a good deck. With that said, so Ramp is probably one of the archetypes synonymous with the US at this point. It's one of their biggest themes. There's a lot of support for it, so in that way you have a lot of options to build your deck or build around it. Notably, your ally can have big impacts. JKing now I can't speak for JKing as I didn't talk to him, but based on what I've seen and how ramp is normally built, the British ally is your defensive end, mostly giving you healing and guards and other defensive tools to supplement the big threats that come out from the US side. But there are other allies, but for today we're going to look at this list, which is probably also one of the more stable versions of the deck. For example, there are other examples like US Soviet, which is a bit more on the value side, and you're even more capable of crushing the enemy under a mountain of just big threats, but you trade away some of that defensive end for it. And this deck is already quite heavy if you look at the curve. Definitely a lot of 5, 6, and 7 drops, which is standard for a ramp deck, but this deck list is definitely could potentially run into some problems if it gets a bad mulligan. But regardless, let's jump into the cards. So the 593rd JASCO, this is just a solid 1-drop. It essentially gives your HQ heavy armor until the enemy can remove it. And that can just buy you so much time. Against aggro decks, their units all having essentially -1 attack is really good. It also can help out against certain combo decks. Although those aren't very common, JASCO can absolutely just delay certain combos from killing you by essentially, usually often negating a lot of their damage. And that can be very effective. It's overall just a good 1-drop, and it in fact is the only 1-drop within the deck. Usually you're going to want to drop that on turn 1, especially if you're going against an aggressive deck. But there are times where you actually do want to save it, normally against control, to play it at an opportune time, because even later into the game, 4 health is quite a lot, and it doesn't get killed off by incidental stuff like a board clear or something like that. Overall, really nice defensive tool that has some extra utility in certain cases. Next up, you have War Machine. This is just like the set standard ramp card. You almost always are looking to draw and play this on turn 2 to gain that extra credit slot. Although later on it gets less effective, and if you're drawing it into the late game, you probably want to save it until you're at 12 credits, because if you gain a credit at 12 credits, then you're going to get pushed up to 13 credits or 14 credits and on and on. If you're on around 8 or so credits, I recommend holding off on War Machine. Try to save it for a couple turns. Obviously, it can entirely depend on the scenario, but generally, you want to either play it really early, like turn 2, 3, maybe 4, or even turn 5. But you don't want to play it afterwards until you're at 12 credits to get above that credit limit, because that is one of the strengths of the US ramp deck, is that it very consistently gets above 12 credits, which allows it to function extremely well as a by allowing it to just play more stuff and do more stuff each turn. Moving on, you have the M3A3 Honey, the first British card of the deck. This is just, as it is in like every British deck, or in any deck running Britain, this is like just one of those standard cards you can put in and never feel bad about. It is a solid body, a vanilla body, that also just draws you cards. Or whenever you draw a card, your HP gains defense. And that's really nice. It's incidental health gain. You know, you can play it down early to help contest aggro, and they have to kind of deal with it, as otherwise you're going to gain life. And it's just overall a very effective 2-drop. You never feel bad about this. Moving on from that, you have the M18 HELLCAT. This is a card that maybe looks a bit out of place, but the M18 HELLCAT is just a really good 3-drop. Now, you don't want to play it on turn 3. At the earliest, you want to be able to play it down and then blitz, but this essentially can be read as a damage-based order. It often is about, you pay 4 or 5 credits to deal 4 damage to whatever you want. And that's quite effective, notably because it goes face. And you're able to, on certain occasions, you're able to just play this down and help it burst the enemy and kill them. And especially with Ramp's ability to have so many credits, the HELLCAT is super cheap for that. And then, as I said before, you can just use it as a removal. You know, you play it down, and then you move it and attack something, and you paid 4 credits to deal 4 damage. That is not the worst deal in the world. So HELLCAT, even if it looks a bit weird, is a super flexible card and is just really nice overall. Then you move on to the U.S. military research. So the research has is a card that is a bit difficult to explain if you don't know it, but essentially you either take a presented option or you go up the tech tree, because it's almost like a tree, and you pick an option or you move on to the next one, and then you do that again and again. And there's 4 different cards. You have depth charges, pressurized cabin, penicillin, and Manhattan Project. So to quickly go over them, depth charges is giving your HQ smokescreen and giving you an extra credit slot. It's a nice anti-aggro tool, and especially against aggro, just being able to buy a turn and get some more credits could save you a lot of pressure. Pressurized cabin adds a B-29 super fortress and a high altitude bombing to your hand. Sadly, this one is not that effective. I would not recommend picking it. It's just, if you're wanting to spend a lot of credits on stuff, we have the Manhattan Project or other things for that. The B-29 is not that effective. High altitude is actually quite a powerful card, but you're paying a lot for that, and you end up with another dead card in hand. So you generally just skip that. Penicillin gives all of your units and HQ +6 defense and draws 4 cards. And this is actually occasionally very worthwhile to pick up. Namely, certain decks have absolutely no way to deal with that. And we'll talk about a card that is essentially a miniature penicillin and why we're running it. But sometimes just having a super big version of just penicillin being so big and turning just a couple units into unkillable, like, behemoths is just sometimes all you need to just snowball a game. And the card draw can also be beneficial. And then the final card is Manhattan Project. You get 2 Manhattan Projects to your hand, and they are 6 credits, deal 6 damage to all enemies. This includes the HQ and all enemy units. So you're able to pay 12 credits and deal 12 damage to all enemies, or split it up into things. And this is really good. Just having 12 HQ damage is a lot, You're also benefiting from having 2 board clears that are relatively cheap and flexible. Manhattan Project is probably the most common one you go for if you don't go for depth charges, but it can be flexible. Like I said, penicillin has some uses. Just really skip over pressurized cabin. It's not that worth it at the moment. But overall, U.S. military research is really, really flexible. It's just got a lot of tools. It's a toolbox card that can present damage or board buffs or just even some defensive tools. And it's very, very flexible. It's a very solid card. Then we move on to In Hour of Need. This card came out with the Legion expansion recently, and as we've seen, it has, at least in this version of ramp, replaced War Bonds. War Bonds was previously the mid-game ramp card, gaining you 2 credit slots and drawing you an extra card on the next turn. However, In Hour of Need costs 1 less but drops the card draw, which is actually beneficial, as this deck has been built around essentially turbo ramping, because you can go turn 2 War Machine and then on turn 4 play In Hour of Need, and then you start turn 4 with a massive 7 credits, which is just insane. That is enough to play any amount of guards, healing, defensive tools, board clears. You can play almost anything in your deck with that curve. War Bonds doesn't do that, because you have to do something on turn 4 and then on turn 5 do that. Well, I shouldn't say turn 4 do that on turn 3. Because if you War Machine, you go to 4 credits on turn 3, and then on turn 4 you'll have 5 credits normally. But the extra, just the speed of War Machine into In Hour of Need makes it so even that the majority of aggro decks often aren't able to severely punish you, where on War Bonds you can get punished. Although the extra card draw can be useful, as we'll see in a minute, we have a lot of card draw in this deck, so the extra draw on War Bonds is not worth it, and the speed of In Hour of Need is much more beneficial. Next up, we have SEAFORTH Highlanders. This is just another really solid defensive British card. It's a 4/7 guard on your turn. That is just absolutely massive. And the SEAFORTH Highlanders are excellent defensive and stalling tools. Again, they also curve very nicely with War Machine, so you can go turn 2 War Machine and then turn 3 have a SEAFORTH Highlanders out, and the enemy is just not going to have a way to deal with that. It just makes SEAFORTH Highlanders highly effective and very difficult to deal with. Even control decks will often have a hard time removing it until they get to their late game cards, because there's just not a lot that deals with 7 health, and especially not when it also has 4 attack. On the offensive, this card should never be used on the offensive. That measly 1 attack is just pointless. I mean, there are occasions where you want to put it in the front line, to contest the front line, especially against certain aggro decks. If you can put this in the front line and it has some amount of health, that can completely just end the game for certain aggro decks. But otherwise, you don't want to try to be attacking into stuff with this unless you're really desperate. You often want the enemy to come to you rather than you go to it with the Highlanders. Moving on from that, you have the P40N5. This is just a very effective 4-drop. It is a 4/3 fighter, but anytime the enemy plays a unit, they get +2 operation costs, and that's as long as the unit remains on the board. They have to return it to hand or reduce the operation cost in some other way to get rid of it. If you can get this down, and the enemy can't deal with it, it is a massive headache for them. There just is not a lot you can do with your units in order to deal with the P40N, and as such, it is just highly disruptive. Various decks will just suffer if you can get this down, especially if you protect it behind a guard such as the SEAFORTH Highlanders. Just a really annoying card overall for people to deal with. It also is just a 4/3 fighter, and that can apply a modest amount of pressure, which is sometimes useful, and we'll explain why. Even just having it, sometimes you just play it down on turn 4 because you have it's a 4-drop. It entirely depends, but usually the earlier the P40 comes down, the more annoying it is. Later on, people often have the credits to play a removal order and then play their units, so it's not that big of a deal. But early on, definitely highly disruptive. Then you have the PBY Catalina. This is another 4-drop bomber. This one is a card drawing monster, though. At the start of your turn, you draw 2 cards, and then you put a card from your hand back on top of your deck. That means you're drawing 3 cards every turn, and then having to put your worst card on the top of your deck. It is incredible draw, and just allows you to pretty much sculpt your hand however you need it, whenever it sticks. And it does stick quite a lot, because a 3/5 is just a lot of health, especially on turn 4, or again, as with everything on turn 4, you can play it on turn 3 with War Machine. It is just a highly effective card, and just gives us a lot of card draw. Then we move on to a card that you may not always see in this, but in this deck it serves a very useful purpose. We Can Do It. It gives your units an HQ plus 3 defense and then draws a card, essentially replacing itself. This card is very good at turning any modest board into a pretty terrifying monster. Even just a few units turned is enough to make We Can Do It very, very powerful. Again, even stuff like M18 HELLCATs, Honeys, the P40, the Catalina, any of those early cards, just a couple of them, turns We Can Do It into a very potent card, because they all become like 2/6s or like a 3/8 in the case of the Catalina, and that is just so much health to eat through. It also has the benefit of healing our HQ a little bit, which saves us some deck slots that we might otherwise have to dedicate in Britain to like fortifications. Because Honeys on their own is not enough healing usually, if you're really worried about that, and that's where We Can Do It comes in, which just gives us a very solid amount of removal. Or not removal, sustain and healing. It also, again, draws a card, so it replaces itself, so it's never going to really be bad. It's just a really solid card and allows you to build boards, especially because there is a number of decks that don't have a way to deal with a couple big bombers having, 7-8 HP each. There's a couple that most decks have like one answer, but if you can ever bait that out, then We Can Do It will just sometimes win you the game and just make it impossible to deal with. Following that up, you have Mobilization. Mobilization is 5 credits, draw 3 cards. This is a relatively big card draw order, and works well in ramp, because ramp is able to oftentimes gain a lot of credits really quickly, and then uses Mobilization to refill itself. There's honestly not a lot to say. It's just a really nice card to make sure you never run out of cards in the ramp deck. Very effective. Then you have the RAAF Lightning F-4, which is a high tempo card. Being able to force an enemy unit to retreat is highly effective and can be very disruptive for many of the slower units that certain decks play. You definitely have to be careful with this, as if you do not, as if you bounce something with a deployment effect, then they're going to be able to replay it. But there definitely is a good amount of units that are very nice to buff or to bounce back. Also, it's very effective against buffs. For example, if the enemy has some big buffed unit in their support line, you can retreat it and essentially wipe that buff away, which is nice utility. But RAF is also just a decent body on itself. A 3/5 fighter is not the easiest thing to kill. Being able to bounce some enemy unit alongside that can lead to you helping win the board early into the mid game, and just give you the ability and breathing room you need. So RAF is just a really solid unit overall. Moving on from that, you have the 101st Airborne. It is 5 credits for the 4/3 ambush blitz, and then the deployment effect of dealing 2 damage. 101st has a lot going on, and it just does a lot of different things. It's able to deal that 2 damage to anything, meaning that worst case it hits the enemy HQ for a bit of damage, but it's also very useful to pair up with various removal orders that I'm going to talk about in a minute, namely board clears to help finish off certain things. And then also the ambush is very annoying to deal with, and the fact that it also has blitz on top of that. It is just a very flexible and well-rounded card that is just extremely nice to have and just be able to use at your discretion. Again, the ambush is very good at blocking things in the front line. The blitz allows it to immediately move into the front line, which buffs the which makes ambush more effective, but also allows it to immediately threaten the enemy HQ. And then, as I said, the deployment effect is very well rounded in its effect. It's just overall a very solid 5-drop. Also gets kind of crazy if you can land some weakened duets on it, because then it becomes like a 4-6 ambush, and that's just like really annoying to deal with, and there's just not a lot the enemy can do to remove it if they don't have like a hard removal order, which they don't always want to spend on the 101st, especially because we have a lot of big things coming up. Moving on from that, you have the Grenadier Guards. It is 6 credits for a massive guard. 5.9 is massive. It's doesn't need to be fast, you know, it doesn't need a deployment effect. The sheer amount of stats that the Grenadier Guards has and the amount of health that you have to go through on its guard makes it amazing at stalling. And a low operation cost and 5 attack means that it also can turn on the aggression. It can move into the front line, and the enemy kinda has to deal with it, because otherwise it's gonna just start smacking the HQ for very, very cheap. So Grenadier Guards, not much else to say about it. It's just a really solid big guard. Probably the best big guard within the game at the moment, and just very effective overall. Beyond that, you have Strategic Bombing. One of the board clears within this deck. It only hits stuff in the support line, but that is often useful enough because you're able to disrupt a variety of units. Oftentimes against control decks, very useful at just sniping off stuff like stray honeys, or like cheap bombers, or like even just like slightly damaged units. And that makes the strategic bombing very effective at that. It also makes the enemy lose a credit slot, which actually does have a fair amount of merit. Being able to set your enemy, essentially stall the enemy a turn credit, can sometimes be just what you need to turn a board that might have gotten cleared into something the enemy cannot deal with. I have in several times used strategic bombing, and even though the AoE didn't hit much, that credit slot gave me one more turn where the enemy was unable to deal with my board, and then I was able to do something like we can do it and just snowball it out of control as they just no longer could answer it. So overall, strategic bombing, another really effective card and one of our first board clears. The other board clears are the carpet bombings. This is, I don't really need to say a lot about this. Carpet bombing, as I say pretty much every time we talk about Britain, is one of those cards that if you're playing Britain, you run 2 copies of it, because carpet bombing is insanely good. It's a very effective board clear, kills almost everything, or leaves it on just like 1 or 2 life, which is easy enough to get rid of. Carpet bombing is just very, very good. Beyond that, you have a single copy of Lend-Lease, which was a bit confusing to me, but I understand why. Because this deck is very good at just absolutely running its hand to nothing. And having essentially a third mobilization is really useful. This deck definitely has some hand issues, and if you didn't have this extra Lend-Lease in here, you'd rely mainly on the mobilizations and sticking the Catalina to draw you a lot of cards. So the Lend-Lease, the single copy of it, is really nice to make sure you always have cards to play, and makes sure you can keep that pressure on even long after other decks might otherwise run out of stuff. Moving on from that, you have the TBF-1 Avenger, which is one of the 2 like gold standard ramp cards. It's able to just it is very consistent at blowing up high target units, and you often want to save it again to always hit key units you otherwise wouldn't be able to hit. This can include stuff like IS-2s, other B-17s, stuff like a giant guard or maybe some giant buffed unit. The Avenger is just really, really good. You also have high altitude bombing, which is very effective as hard removal. It's an excellent answer to one of the stronger decks at the moment in Soviet value, as they often have a turn where they make one or two giant units, namely that 272nd Guard combined with Ural Factory. Makes high altitude bombing excellent because you're able to very cleanly and very effectively just remove both of the IS-2s with one card, which otherwise isn't exactly an easy job to do, and high altitude just does it very well. But otherwise, high altitude is just very effective overall, just being able to blow up a lot of enemy units. It's just very effective for a single card. Beyond that, you have the B-17, which is the other gold standard alongside the Avenger. It is a giant bomber that blows up an enemy when you play it. If you can set up the board for it to always hit a high value unit, which isn't particularly hard with how much removal the deck packs in the late game, B-17 can swing the board very hard in your favor, and the enemy will be hard pressed to really answer it. But if they do somehow answer it, you again just always have the second one alongside Avengers and a lot of threats that just it's very hard for many players to, or many decks I should say, to really deal with all of the threats. Beyond that, we have Seaborne Invasion, which after the rework has turned back into a good card. It instantly gives you control of the front line and puts 2 infantry units there with a total attack of 6. And it definitely still has that randomness to it, but in general, you're going to get 1 unit with 2 or 3. You're either getting 2 units with 3 attack, or a 2 attack unit and a 4 attack unit. Sometimes you will get stuff like a 5/5, but generally you get quite a lot of stats in the front line, and it can be highly effective. There is also sometimes the funny times when you get the JASCO alongside the 4th Marines, and if you have the credits, you can instantly blitz with a 6/6. That's quite a fun effect, but not the most common. There's also some really fun moments where you get something like the 47th Infantry Regiment, and if you can gain 1 or 2 credit slots, this thing can become like an 8/8 or a 12/12. And although that's not the most practical thing and you shouldn't plan around it, sometimes when it happens, that will just win you the game. But Seaborne Invasion is very good at turning a board that oftentimes turns the board very much in your favor, and the enemy has to spend quite some time dealing with that. If you have like any bomber backing up a Seaborne Invasion, the board will oftentimes be very much in your favor. And then the final card is the M26 Pershing. This is a giant blitz tank. If you get to 16 credits, you can move in and attack for free, or move in and attack on the same turn as it. Even at 13 credits, you can immediately move it into the front line, which is very effective because it literally makes your HQ unkillable until the M26 Pershing is dealt with. Only fatigue damage will kill it, but the enemy cannot do anything until the Pershing dies. And there are times that is what happens. But otherwise, that's the list. So for the general mulligan, it's pretty straightforward. You generally want a mulligan just for your cheaper cards. 593rd JASCO, War Machine, Honey, the U.S. military research are the main things you're looking for. If you have one of those, I would then look for an In Hour of Need, SEAFORTH Highlander, and then pretty much any 4-drop, to be honest. But you really are looking mainly for one of these two. These are probably the most important. War Machine into Hour of Need, as I said previously, is really, really strong. And you definitely, if you can, want to try to pull that off. If you know you are playing against a slow deck, you can also consider keeping stuff like Mobilization. because you'll be able to more reliably not worry about like getting killed. But be careful with that, because mobilization can oftentimes end up a very dead card against aggro, so you got to be very careful with that. And then in terms of substitutions or any changes that you could consider, there isn't a whole lot. There are maybe one or two things you could change. For example, if you're looking for some more anti-aggro tools, air defense can be effective. You also have like a Woken Giant that you could maybe run a copy or two of. Patrol, potentially. Those can be effective ways. There is also Stars and Stripes, which is not exactly super common. And you would definitely only want to run like one copy of this, but if you really are running into decks that are swarming the board every turn and you feel like you really need more removal, Stars and Stripes can be a useful one of. You could also consider, where is it? It's here somewhere. You could also consider Corsairs, which have been an effective ramp card in the past. And if you feel like you need to amp up your late game threats, the Corsair can be effective in that. The Mustang can also do that to an extent, but after it got nerfed a little bit, after that tiny nerf it took, it's a lot less effective, so I would be hesitant to put the Mustang in. Although I do gotta say the Mustang is a great budget card. If you're missing any of these late game elites in this deck, the Mustang is often a good substitute for it. Beyond that, you could also consider the B-17F. This was the one card that I'm honestly surprised was not included within the list. This is a very hard to deal with unit and can be a monster. And honestly, I think it's entirely reasonable to maybe cut something in favor of the B-17F. As to what that card is a bit up in the air. You could maybe consider like the high altitude bombing. Maybe it's hard to say, but definitely the B-17F is a really good bomber, and you don't want to skip out on it. And if you really need that extra oomph, this would be one of the cards I'd look to. If you feel like you want some mid-game power, you could look to the M3A3 HONEY. However, this was more so of when discard was a more common archetype. With discard becoming less common, the M3A3 HONEY fell off a lot. But not being able to be targeted by enemy orders is a really useful keyword or set of words. It's really useful effect. That's what I'm trying to say, because you're able to just play it on turn 4 or sometimes turn 3, and if the enemy ever forces you to discard, you draw both of them, and it just gives you a lot of strong power. The 32nd Infantry Regiment is also maybe an option, but this would definitely be very much an anti-aggro tool, because you could just find one of them early on and play them all out to help contest the board. I would definitely be careful, because if you run any 32nd, you kind of have to run all 4 of them, so that involves cutting 4 cards from this list, which can be a bit difficult. So just be wary if you do lean into the 32nd, but if you really are struggling with aggro, that could be an effective tool to help you fight against it. On the British side, there isn't a whole lot. Really, the only cards that come to mind that you would maybe want to consider is really 2 cards. Fortification, in order to have more potent healing. That can be highly effective against a handful of the decks. Or Blackwatch, which is right here. Blackwatch is very good against enemy control decks and boosts enemy orders. It is the least effective guard, but for example, you could consider cutting Grenadier Guards for Blackwatch if you're facing a lot of order-heavy decks. like British control and whatnot, because Blackwatch is highly disruptive to them, where Grenadier Guards is less so. I wouldn't replace Seaforth Highlanders with them, though, as the Highlanders serve a very important anti-aggro tool, so just be careful with that. You could also consider cutting the RAF Lightnings, which lowers your mid-game power because you're not having as decent bodies with a proactive effect. You're having a more reactionary card that is more there to disrupt the enemy. But beyond that, that is the deck list. So with that said, we're gonna move on. I got 3 games up for you. 2 of them are actually going. Some of them are wins, some of them are losses. We'll have to see what that ratio is. But I feel it is important, or whenever I do these, I do intend to show a mixture of wins and losses, as I don't think just showing people, hey, look, I won 2 games is enough. I don't think that is a good example, because there is also a lot to learn when you lose games. In fact, I would argue there's even more to learn by watching people lose with decks, because you can see the mistakes, you can see, what went wrong. Maybe I could have done this or that, but I'll be back with you after those games. All right. Now that we're back from those games, as you saw, we definitely had some bad luck with that Japan deck. It is. I definitely feel like it was mostly due to that second Kika that I lost, because he was able to so consistently dig for all those kamikazes, and that killed me. And I just needed one turn to get the Pershing into the front line, and then I don't think he would have been able to kill me, because he had spent so much removal and didn't have to the last man anymore. So it was really close. Bit of a loss. There maybe could have been some things I could have done differently. Maybe applied a bit more pressure, but definitely had to watch out for that to the last man. But yeah, definitely just a bit rough. For the other games, the British deck, facing off against that British control deck, as you saw, it was quite the, I would say, pretty standard control matchup. I continued to just moderately apply pressure until I built a board that he couldn't deal with through We Can Do It and big bombers. And that just led to him kind of rolling over and dying. That's a deck that is really vulnerable to We Can Do It, because they rely so much on carpet bombings to really carry them. And then for the Soviet deck list, that was definitely a very interesting match. Kind of crazy that that person got all 3 spy rings to give him the British research, which led to him getting 3 active sonars, making my hand so insanely expensive. But they spent so much time doing that it ended up costing them the game. But I had been building the board in a way that even if he had board cleared, I could have recovered from it, and definitely kept going. You definitely saw that I took some slow turns against that Soviet deck, because I was very scared of the Partisan into Ural Factory combo. You saw me, if you watched, I kept building my boards in ways that would make him taking stuff ineffective. I tried to make sure that Confusion wouldn't be effective if it took something of mine, and same thing with Partisans. As you saw, they ended up taking that Grenadier Guard, and it overall was effective, but thankfully it's not consistent, and the drops that he got from the Grenadier Guards was ineffective, compared to, it was a 5-4 bomber, and that was just really easy to remove with what I already had on board. That's definitely one thing I'll tell you to watch out for. If you're facing Soviet value, be very, very careful when you go to play your B-17s and your Avengers, because Partisans into Red Banner or Ural can make it into a US 10 drop, and the only 10 drops within the US is a Pershing or the B-17F, and both are really, really hard to deal with. I recommend that if you're playing against one of those decks, try to always have some answer to them taking your B-17 and killing it into a big unit. That is one of the biggest tips I can give to you. But otherwise, that is going to be the deck tech. Again, thank you everybody for helping me reach 100 subscribers. Hopefully this gameplay is useful to you, and hopefully this deck tech performs well. Again, J King, huge thanks to J King, who I got the list from. Obviously a very good player. He also has a channel which I'm actually going to link in the description. He covers a lot of different tournaments and commentates on them, giving his own thoughts and what he would have done or if that was the right play or not. Definitely a lot of very insightful stuff, so definitely go check him out. And beyond that, that is going to be it for today. Again, let me know down in the comments how this deck performs for you, and also if you liked this new video setup. Did you like the games having no commentary, or would you rather me include some commentary over them? I'm very curious to what people think down below. Beyond that, make sure to also subscribe if you haven't. Every week we're going to have a new deck tech alongside some videos on maybe some other things. I hope to hopefully intend to start up the budget deck lists again. It's been a busy time for me in my real life, so it's thrown a lot of things off, but hopefully we can go back to a normal schedule. I know I've been saying that, but I guess we'll just see how it plays out. But otherwise, thank you so much, and I hope you have a good day.